Welcome to another edition of Wicked Problems. We're talking again to someone about EV. I'm joined in this episode by George Symes, someone I know really well and with whom I've worked in the past. So I can tell you that George really knows his stuff when it comes to talking about decarbonising complex fleets, which include things like emergency services, shared mobility operators such as car rentals, car sharing and e-scooter operators. Basically, they're characterised by having spiky demand profiles. George has been in this business for over 15 years and has been consulting with firms in the UK, in Australia, mainland Europe. He has diverse experience within the mobility sector and, as I say, really knows his stuff. So give it a listen. I hope you really enjoy it. You're going to learn loads. Welcome, George, to Wicked Problems. It's fantastic to have you here.
Hello, Toby. Thanks a lot for having me.
Really like to learn a bit about your background. Tell us about your background.
I've mainly been in the transport and infrastructure space, consulting with KPMG and other firms. When I got the opportunity to go out to Australia on a 2-year secondment, I ended up staying for 7 years because it's a hard place to leave. And while I was there working for an agricultural logistics company, which is one of the most traditional industries you can possibly imagine, I started to see a few things change. This is back in 2016. And electrification was getting a lot of attention. Autonomous vehicles were, and also sharing-based commercial models were really a hot topic. So decided that was the point that I was going to go my own way as an independent consultant and help large complex fleets to electrify. And since then, I've had the opportunity to work with loads of great clients, breakdown recovery organizations in Australia, car rental companies such as Avis Budget and Enterprise, mainly in Europe. And then the last 2 years, emergency services as well, which is probably the most interesting of all the fleet types that I've worked with and the most complex. And we can get it. Well, I guess we'll get into it. But each of these fleet types throw up their own unique challenges, and that's the bit that really excites me. How do we overcome those challenges to decarbonize the fleet?
Yeah. So despite there being complex fleets, they all have their own characteristics. So breakdown recovery is not the same as car rental. Is not the same as emergency services or what some people call blue lights.
Exactly. So if you take, say, car rent, typical car rental use case, customer arrives in south of Spain and just want to get to their villa and have their holiday. Back in 2016, the last thing they wanted was an electric vehicle. So it's about finding the right use case within the fleets for the EV. And back then, vehicle manufacturers, like the pressure was coming from the vehicle manufacturers. They were trying to hit emissions targets. Early adopters were sucking up some of the EV volume, but not enough. And the relationship that the vehicle OEMs have with car rental companies is not your traditional customer relationship. It's more of a symbiotic relationship. So manufacturers can actually put a lot of pressure on the rental companies and force them to take volume. And that's exactly what was happening. So we had 1,000 EVs to deploy across Europe, and we were trying to work out, well, how on earth do we do this? And how do we, at that stage, how do we limit the damage? It was a damage limitation exercise.
Damage limitation in what sense?
In the sense that, if we take that use case of customer arriving for their holiday and they've got, 1 to 2 hour drive, the language is different, the road rules are different, the road signage is different, everything is unfamiliar, including the vehicle, even if it is a combustion vehicle. So the last thing from the customer or the driver's point of view, last thing they want is to add on more complexity and more unknowns on top of that. So we started by running pilots in urban areas and pilots for shorter term rental. So rather than renting by the day, renting by the hour, that proved to be quite popular. That was the start of it. So it's all about finding that right fit between a product that at the time these companies were forced to take on and where the demand is, where the right use case is.
And they were forced in part because of what's known as the ZEV mandate. Is that right?
Yeah. So that's it. Yeah. So back then it was the CAFE emissions targets. And then today, and that applied Europe-wide. And then today in the UK, it's all about the ZEV mandate. That's the hot topic. So it's arguably one of the most ambitious pieces of transport decarbonisation regulation. And I know on some of the previous interviewees you've had with Sam Clark and others, you've touched on it. Essentially what it is, for anyone who doesn't know, is it mandates a percentage quota that vehicle manufacturers have to hit when they sell vehicles in the UK. So a minimum percentage of zero-emission vehicles. And it started last year where the target was 22% battery electric. And then that figure, 22% zero emission, I should say, the vast majority of which is battery electric. Can sell hydrogen, but won't go there. Limited volume, very limited market. So 22% then rising to 80% by 2030 and 100% by 2035. So, and I think one of the really interesting things that we've seen with the data that's just come through in the last couple of weeks is that car manufacturers will do anything to hit these targets. The target 22%, they came in just below that at about 20%. But if you look at what happened in December, December sales were 60% battery electric. That's December 2024. They were 60% higher than the previous December. So yeah, they were scrambling to shift volume of battery electric vehicles and meet those targets.
And that's through discounting or other methods? Because presumably that creates a great opportunity for those people who want to go and buy a battery electric vehicle.
Absolutely. They've got two levers. The first lever is discounting and marketing and promotion to shift the battery electric volume. But because the targets are percentage targets rather than absolutes, they've also got the other lever, which is restricting sales of combustion engine vehicles. And this is a really interesting one because, if they don't meet the target and they sell too many, they get hit with a huge penalty to the tune of £15,000 per vehicle. So actually restricting combustion sales is probably the easier of the two levers to pull. And we're starting to see that already. Starting to see that with the closure of the Luton plant. Stellantis put that squarely on the ZEV mandate. So there's lots of brinkmanship going on. There's lots of lobbying going on, but beneath it, there are some really hard targets which have to be met, and they're being taken seriously by manufacturers.
Oh, interesting. So look, bringing it back to, and it is interesting, like the sales of electric vehicles. There's been lots and lots of press, lots of discussion on social media like LinkedIn. But bringing it back for the moment, because you talked about how you were really, when you went out to Australia, you were looking at complex fleets. Because, if you're buying a fleet of vehicles, very different than me going to my local dealership and buying a car. How's that panning out? Did fleets move early? Have they been late to market? How's that going?
Fleets have definitely moved earlier than private buyers. The fleet's typically more focused on what's called the total cost of ownership of a vehicle. So not just the purchase price, but the economics right from purchase to disposal throughout the whole life of the vehicle. And when you take that holistic view, you can see how actually electric is favorable for most vehicle types, almost all vehicle types now. So fleet managers, take that kind of economic frame of reference more than most private buyers. And that's what's driven the larger uptake in the fleet sector. One interesting thing is how fleets are being affected by the ZEV mandate. So all fleets will have a different motivation for decarbonisation. For some, it will be air quality or climate crisis or some corporate statements, some objective that they have to meet. But for emergency services, it's now becoming an issue of service continuity, because many of the vehicles that they depend on, particularly for for complex roles such as police chases or containment, many of the vehicles that they depend on for those types of roles are high performance vehicles, and they're the ones that are already starting to transition over to electric, with manufacturers only offering the electric versions, stopping sales completely of the combustion versions. So pretty soon, over the next 2 to 3 years, it is highly likely that there'll be no combustion or hybrids version of some vehicle models. And police forces, ambulance services will be in a position where the only vehicle to purchase for those vehicle roles will be an electric. If you talk about wicked problems, this is right up there on the spectrum of wicked problems.
Interesting. So if I'm a police force and I'm buying a high performance car, because I've got to have a high performance car if I'm going to outchase the people I'm chasing, what's going to be available is only going to be electric, because the internal combustion engines that will be available won't be as powerful as I need them to be.
Completely. So there are two issues. The first issue is, can the vehicle do what the police force wants it to do. Can it go as fast? In most cases, yes. Can it carry the same payload for all the kit and equipment that needs to go in the back? Sometimes that's a real pinch point. And then, of course, the second layer is, well, how are we going to keep it charged and how are we going to do this if currently the vehicles are out almost all the time on a 24/7 basis and rarely come back, or when they do come back to base, it might just be for a half an hour shift changeover before they go back out. So it's a case of integrating the vehicle and charging technology with the operational needs of the organization, and where there's a gap, where the technology can't fully meet the current operational requirements, working out what needs to change in the operation to meet the limitations of that technology. Can we change shift patterns? Can we make more use of the public charging network? Can we make do with a lower payload or a lower speed? So it's a kind of iterative process that many police forces and ambulance services are starting to go through, saying, well, what are the must-haves? What are the nice-to-haves? And how do we make this work? Because this is going to this change is coming whether we like it or not. So yeah, need to prepare ourselves as best we can.
I'm getting a very strong sense, right? Emergency service vehicles are very different to car fleets, and you've had experience across, so that I've heard, 3 different types of complex fleets. So you've got these sort of emergency services where they return to the depot, but it's not for very long. So presumably they need very high power charging capabilities, but of course they don't want to fry the battery either. And then you've got the car rental where I suppose they do return to the depot and they get charged, but it's not urgent. It's not urgent in the same way that an emergency services vehicle is. And also, of course, the driver who hires the car will be responsible for, I guess, topping it up and maybe even returning it with a minimum amount of state of charge. And then you've got your Royal Mail or DHL or whoever it is, these guys that are out delivering stuff. It could be Ocado, it could be Tesco, whoever, but they're delivering stuff. And so they want to maximize the use of their fleet because, the more they're out delivering stuff, the more they're making money, the more they're sat hooked onto a charger, the less they're making money, kind of thing. How prepared and how is that rollout going? Do people understand the challenges that they need to face in their individual fleets, or is that still quite nascent? How's that going?
I think it really depends on the fleet types. If we take some of those fleets you mentioned, a delivery fleet, for example, like Royal Mail, they'll have a very high proportion of predictable, repetitive trips. The vehicle gets parked overnight, and more often than not, it's parked at the depot rather than near the driver's home. If you look at car rental fleets, it's much harder because the turnaround time will be unpredictable between when a customer returns it and when it's next booked out. Margins are very tight, but again, they're mostly in depots which are relatively modern. They're at transport hubs. If you then look at emergency services fleets, the depots or the stations, the hospitals, they're often legacy sites. They're extremely space constrained. I went around a police station the other day and, vehicles are routinely triple parked. So you've already got that problem of like one of those slidey square games. We have to slide the pieces around to make the picture.
and complicated by the fact that the picture itself changes while you're doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And then of course, because it's emergency services by its very nature, lots of the trips are urgent. So you've got a very low percentage of predictable, repetitive trips. In many cases, the vehicles are not parked overnight and not even for more than 30 minutes when they are parked. At shift change over time. Then you've got high payloads, higher speeds, and acceleration requirements. So when you put all of these characteristics together, you say, okay, it's those types of trips that high performance vehicles perform. And it's also the high performance vehicles which are at most combustion engine version availability risk. It means that police forces and to a lesser extent ambulance services are being forced to jump in at the deep end. So they're being forced to really understand how to integrate these complex vehicles into their operations first. So they understand that, the charging requirement, how many chargers, what power, before then embarking on a wider rollout of the easier vehicles. Because if you start with the easy vehicles and the easy sites, then you get so far, then you come up against a bit of a brick wall where, okay, well, we've put in loads of chargers, 7 kilowatt chargers at this site, and that's great. We can charge all of the vehicles that stay put overnight. And now what do we do about the rest of the fleet? Okay, we have to start ripping out chargers and reconfiguring the whole site. So that's the big kind of future proofing risk that's now, almost turning from a risk into an issue because it's inevitable.
There's an interesting point there, because not all police cars have to be high powered, right? So you do, yes, if you're giving chase to some bad person or suspected bad person, probably I should say, in a vehicle, you need to be able to normally you need to be able to out chase them. That always have to be able to, because you can radio ahead and have somebody intercept, I suppose. But you don't need high performance cars if you're doing routine sort of door to door or community support or whatever it might be, the sort of not non-chasing kind of stuff. But if you started at that end and went to the high performance, you'd actually hit more brick walls than if you start at the high performance and come back down through the fleet. I think that's what you're saying.
That's the risk. And again, in the same breath, I'll say better to do something than to do nothing. I think for some fleets or some police forces that have started just doing the easy stuff, they've then kind of come up against a bit of a barrier whereby doing supporting the tougher vehicles in their electric capacity, like the more complex vehicles, just requires a completely different thought process. It's almost a negotiation, with the officers. What's really required here? Do you need a vehicle that goes quite that fast? Do you need to carry the same payload? And I think the way to really solve that problem and to chip away at it is twofold. So firstly, telematics, like installing telematics on the fleet so that you know exactly where they are, where they travel, how fast they go. That can help you estimate the energy required to complete those trips, but also how much time they spend back at the depot. So what's your charging opportunity window? So having that evidence base is great, but then the theory and the desktop analysis only gets you so far. Ultimately, you just need to get on and do it and try it in the real world. So running pilots to test the theory and to see how much it bears out in practice is really important. And that's exactly what the Met Police and many other forces are doing around the country, running pilots to validate what we think will work and also to identify any other issues that crop up.
We're business performance management consultancy. We go out and help people understand how to work more efficiently in their ways of working. I think if I was to apply the sort of agile principles that we often bring to a business, and we were to apply those to the scenario that you're talking about there, it's kind of fail fast. It's a test and learn type scenario, right? You don't know, so you're going to have to try some things out, and then you're going to, funnel in on the right solution. And then, interesting, you talked about telematics there. So you've got the police, the ambulance services, the fire services. Perhaps you bring telematics into the equation so that you can understand, when is the car going to need to charge, where is it often used, etc. In a sense, that's not that dissimilar from a software or a sort of evaluation from software perspective to, in my head at least, what's happening in my Audi, right? When it's saying you want to get from here to there, there's not enough charge. I recommend you stop at this services to charge up, or at this, place, and there's a high performance charger and I can guide you to it, that sort of thing. Or the telematics that presumably the other complex fleets, like if I am the Royal Mail, I'm going to be plotting out where's this person going to be going today to do, or if I'm DHL, where are they going to go today to do their deliveries? And therefore, I'm factoring in the charge into also, so I've got the one variable is the charging, the state of charge, the number of parcels, the route that we need to get, or the route is then perhaps calculated by those factors. So it becomes much more intelligent, in quotes, that way.
Yes, yeah, completely. And what you just described there is really the nirvana for emergency services. So once they have gone electric, having the command and control center, which is the call center that receives all the 999 calls, having them factor in state of charge in their dispatch decisions is, I suppose, a laudable goal. And that's what lots of forces are aiming for. To get there, yes, your telematics has to tell you your state of charge, but the prize is big because then you can say vehicle X, go to instant Y, vehicle A, charge up 15 minutes because actually there's a charging station right near you and there's nothing going on in the area, so you're not needed. So this is a good opportunity to charge up.
Yeah, so you could be told to go and charge if you're emergency services, go and charge now because actually things are a little bit quiet. It's for whatever reason, certain time of day or certain time of the week or whatever it might be. For whatever reason, things are a little bit quiet now. You're at 40% and okay, that's not an issue in itself, but why not go and top up and get yourself? So if I'm driving, I will often charge because I've stopped. I'm not stopping to charge, but I've stopped and therefore I'll hook it onto a charge and give myself 20% more, let's say, because I'm going in to get a sandwich from Waitrose or a coffee from Costa or whatever it is. In the same way, you might say, okay, well, please go, I don't know how to identify a police car, but, car number 6, go and, sit yourself on that charger for 20 minutes because actually there's enough people in the area to cover anything that's going to happen. It's fairly quiet. Give yourself another 30% charge or whatever it is. And then, that's good to go.
Completely. So yeah, optimizing the day-to-day is one part of telematics. And then the other part is to say, well, to install the appropriate number and power of chargers, telematics is a prerequisite. We've got to have that because that provides the evidence base. Without that, we're just reliant on anecdotes and interviews. So I think having that evidence base is really important, and more forces and ambulance services are now seeing that telematics is about more than just service maintenance and repair. It's actually about providing a foundational layer for your EV transition.
How are we getting on in terms of the good, the bad, the ugly? I mean, if you're doing test and learn, there are going to be some, hopefully not too horrendous, but there will be one or two tales of woe, and there'll be some stunning successes, I would imagine, as well. What have you seen and across all of the different complex fleet types?
When it comes to many fleets, they initially start out going broad and shallow, start with the easiest part of the fleet first. As I say, I think it's better to do that than do nothing at all. But at some point, you've got to bite the bullet and you've got to go narrow and deep. So understand further, the higher performance vehicles that are perhaps most at risk of switching over to EV with no combustion engine version available for sale whatsoever. Got to really understand how that fits with the existing operation. So if you think of different personas within an organization, you have your fleet manager, they'll be kind of mainly focused on the day-to-day. You have your property teams. They know there's a need for charging infrastructure, but often they sort of want to know exactly where, when, and how many chargers. Give me an X on the wall, and then I'll install a charger. Unless I have the X, then I'm not going to do anything. So you got this kind of standoff between two teams, and this applies to emergency services, delivery fleets, rental fleets, where if there's no recognition at the top of the organization, then you've got these teams which are focused on the day-to-day, and there's no capacity and hence no inclination or dare I say a capability to really take on the challenge. So I think it has to be driven from the top. Once you've got that, then and you've got some funding behind it and you've got some you've built capability in the organization, then things really start to happen. And some of the biggest successes in the UK have been made where there's a real kind of EV transition team that works cross-functionally across both those teams, fleet, property, but also all of the other areas of the organization that an EV transition touches, because ultimately it is a transformation program. It affects HR policies, it affects finance. It's actually hard to think of a function that is unaffected by a fleet decarbonisation.
I can absolutely see that. And any stats on where people are going and with this and how well it's progressing?
If I look at police fleets, there's one fleet. There's one police force. I won't name and shame them. They were an early mover, and they electrified 20% of their fleet. So, switched 20% over to battery electric. Their estate is almost entirely leased. So they're almost entirely reliant on public charging. And as a result, it's been a very bumpy road. If you look at the Dutch police force, so they're a national police force, and I think it's perhaps a learning there in itself that they're national rather than 45 regional police forces as we are in the UK. So they're national force of 14,000 vehicles. They're only up to 7% battery electric, but there are some key learnings that I think we can draw from their experience. So they're not buying any more plug-in hybrids. It's like a laudable ambition to have the best of both worlds, best of plug-in, and you've got the power and the distance should you need it. But ultimately, the nature of emergency services, the drivers are not going to charge them up. So they'll be driven around as combustion engine cars with flat batteries. So no more plug-in hybrids. And actually the regulation in Holland is just like the regulation in the UK, where it's only battery electric that are being incentivized. Car manufacturers don't get any points for selling plug-in hybrids. And I think the other kind of learning from Holland is empowering local teams to make their own decisions. So give them access to the software that sits behind the chargers so that they can then manage the charging on their own sites.
Yeah, so it's the charge point management software that they're giving them access to. Is that right?
Completely. And a lot of clever things you can do with the charge point software. It's not just about reporting and seeing when a vehicle is available for dispatch, for example, but it's also about control. So with some of these systems, you've got the ability to set a charging prioritization level. So you might have an emergency response vehicle as top priority, but then you've got a kind of logistics vehicle as a lower priority. So it means that when the emergency vehicle pulls up in the charging bay at a police station or a health service and wants to get a charge within 30 minutes, it means that the power is prioritized to that vehicle rather than prioritized based on vehicle capability. So the power is prioritized based on operational needs rather than vehicle capability. And that's really important. It's a subtle nuance, but I think that takes away a bit more responsibility from the driver. So you're asking them to do less. You're not asking them to park in a particular bay. Like if you prioritize charging by bays, you're asking them just to charge the vehicle, and then the software will manage the distribution of the power amongst the array of chargers at that site.
That software being able to distribute that power in the right way, it makes a huge difference really to the overall performance for those fleets. I can see that completely. George, we're a little bit over time actually, because as always happens with these things, the conversation can just keep going and going and going. And much as I'd like it to do that, I want to respect your time and the time of the viewers and listeners. Before we do sign off, if people wanted to learn more about the stuff that you do, anywhere they should go?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, and you can also go to my website, which is evaluatestrategy.com. I don't do any social media beyond LinkedIn. I probably should do more on LinkedIn, but that's where I am, and I'm usually quite good at getting back to people.
George, it's been wonderful to have you. Thank you so very much for joining us, and good luck with helping those complex fleets to decarbonise. We really need it.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Toby.